As everyone is gathering back in, just a reminder that we do have some booths outside in the pre-function area. There are sign-up sheets out there for an upcoming event that's going to happen early 2017, and you'll hear more about that after this speaker. There's some sheets for folks dealing with suicide support group. There are books for sale. So a lot of information, some great booths, and people who have come in on a Saturday morning to make sure that we know the resources in our community. The stories have been wonderful. The stories have been sad, but the stories have brought us hope. Each of our speakers have a story. We have stories in our community. We have the national people like Robin Williams. Recently, the story was in Dallas. We had a district attorney who, having gone through her career, having a successful position, ran for the DA's office, and then her story was front page. After she resigned, the mental health experts said she will be likely remembered for the community-wide conversation she started about mental illness as she publicly struggled with depression and mood disorder. Susan Hawk's illness, her very public profile and illness, is making people talk and letting people know that it can happen to anyone. And I think that's what we have talked about today. It can happen to real people like you and me. It can happen to celebrities. Mental illness can happen to anyone. Mental illness, I've heard many people say they appreciate her being so candid. As we continue the stories, our next speaker is going to talk to us about how to deal with the issues in our community. Michelle Snyder is director of Soul Soup, a national movement that equips faith community leaders to minister to those impacted by suicidal desperation. She is trained both in theology and mental health. She has extensive experience as a chaplain, a therapist, a public speaker, a suicide intervention trainer, and as a congregational consultant. She is also the executive director of the Pittsburgh Pastoral Institute, a Samaritan Counseling Center, and has recently published a book, Life, Death, and Reinvention: The Gift of the Impossibly Messed Up Life. Michelle lives in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, that is, with her husband, a Presbyterian pastor, and her 2 daughters. Please welcome Michelle Snyder to Tyler, Texas.
Good morning. It's great to be with you today. Tyler, Texas wasn't even on my radar when I got this invitation. I brought my sister with me. She's out there selling books. And we flew into Dallas, and we thought we would kind of do Texas. So we went to, yeah, right, that's a small undertaking. So we went to Dallas and Fort Worth and Waco, because that's all close, right? About 6 o'clock, when we were in Waco and we GPS'd Tyler, we realized, oh wow, we're really far from Kansas. So it's been great to get to explore all the wonders that are Texas. It's also great to see a community this size turn out this many people on a Saturday morning to talk about this super important subject. So I'm inspired by you, and it's great to be with you. So there's lots of ways to give your resume, and our prestigious mayor, who is lovely, and I sat beside at dinner last night. I know she's not the mayor anymore, but she kind of acts like she is. We were at dinner, and she gave the instructions to the waiter to cut the music, and they did. So I know that we're in the presence of a powerful woman. So she has given you a bit of my resume, and all the things that she said are true. I'm trained in both mental health and theology. And that means I went to seminary, and I have my master's in social work. And that means that my specialty, my area of expertise, is the place where mental health meets faith. It's the place where the mental health community comes into a conversation with faith community. And that's what Samaritan counseling centers do so well. So I'm the director of a Samaritan counseling center. I'm a therapist. I'm a faculty person at the University of Pittsburgh School of Social Work, so I teach social work. I'm an author. She has said all of those things about me. But those aren't the reasons that I was invited here today. Actually, if I step away, I still have a microphone. Awesome. Okay. That's not the reason that I was invited to be here with you today. I was invited to be here with you today because of the program that I direct called Soul Shop, not Soup. Unless that helps you remember it better, then call it Soup. But it's actually called Soul Shop. Soul Shop is a movement. Our website is www.soulshopmovement.org because we're a movement. The vision of the movement is to reach 20,000 faith communities by 2020, to create communities of safety, to create soul-safe communities that know how to minister to those who are impacted by suicidal desperation. We've done Soul Shop in 18 states. I was just in Hawaii in August. We're coming back here to do it in February. And so I direct Soul Shop. Soul Shop was started by my colleague who was the pastor of a Presbyterian church in wherever Columbus is, southwest Ohio. He was a pastor of in a small community. In a high school with 300 students, 3 of them died by suicide in 1 year. That's not uncommon, right? So 3 of them died by suicide, and so he started working in suicide prevention. He ended up writing the suicide prevention plan for the state of Ohio. And he would find that wherever he would go to talk about suicide, he'd get 100 people in the room. Nothing like this, but still a number of people. He'd get 100 people in the room, and all the time we're talking about needing to engage faith communities. Faith communities need to be at the table. Churches are a pivotal part of this, and 2 pastors would show up. Out of 100 people, only 2 pastors would show up. And so Soul Shop was born as a way of saying, how do we get people of faith in the room to have conversations about our responsibility to each other's souls? And there you have the birth of Soul Shop. But I was invited to talk to you today kind of as the wrap-up speaker. Eric and Melissa did an extraordinary job inspiring us, not just you, inspiring us. They told their stories of despair and hope, and they did their job. Now, my job is to put flesh on those bones, because we can get excited, we can feel inspired, we can feel motivated and energized, but if we don't know what to do next, I think that there's a parable about a seed falling on the ground and growing up quickly and then dying off. We need to know what to do next, and that requires roots. So that's why I'm here to talk to you about suicide. Henry David Thoreau said that the great mass of men, he meant women too, so let's say, the great mass of men and women lead lives of quiet desperation. So I'm here for a suicide workshop to talk to you about that. I'm going to say, you're going to hear me talk about suicidal desperation. And what I mean by that is 4 groups of people. When I talk about those who are impacted by suicidal desperation, I'm talking about, 1, those who are thinking about suicide. 2, those who have lost someone to suicide. That sense of desperation never goes away. 3, those who are worried about someone who is thinking about suicide. And 4, those who have been suicidal in the past but have never felt free to share their story. Those are the 4 groups of people. You know, let's say American Foundation for Suicide Prevention. If they were to stop all suicides tomorrow, they would go out of business, right? Because they have accomplished their goal, no more suicides. For me, and I think for us, if we are people of faith in the room, we care about what's going on inside of someone. And so if you end all suicides tomorrow, but you've got a bunch of people walking around who don't want to live, we still have work to do. So when I talk about suicidal desperation, that's an expansive conversation for me. So the goal would be, I think our goal today when we talk about soul-safe communities is to move from quiet desperation to honest conversations about suicide. It is as simple as that. So let's talk about how prevalent this is. Suicide we can think about sort of like an iceberg. The most recent statistics that I could find are that, I think those are 2013 statistics, that the number of reported suicides in America were 41,149. That's the number of suicides that the CDC reported in 2013. What we also know is that however many reported suicides there are 5 to 25% more suicides that go unreported. I was noting from Eric's presentation that when he jumped out of a car, it was not reported that that was a suicide attempt, right? So there's all kinds of reasons that suicide is not reported. Concerns about life insurance. Life insurance may not pay, and so it doesn't get reported that way. The ambiguous causes. Was it an overdose? Was it a car accident? Or was it a suicide? But mostly, I think, as we've been hearing from our other speakers, it's about shame and stigma. Melissa's story, you can hide the suicide note if you want, right? So 5 to 25% more suicides than are reported. So let's say that that number jumps to 51,000. 25% more than 41,000 is 51,000. That's more deaths than occur by homicide in any given year. That's more deaths than in all the wars that we have fought. If you were to fly jets into the Twin Towers every single month of the year for an entire year, you still wouldn't equal the same number of deaths as the number of suicides in a year. That's how many people we're talking about when we talk about 51,000. In addition to that, for every one person that dies by suicide, there is somewhere between 40 and 100 attempts. And so that number, what is that number? 4 million. Somewhere around 4 million are the number of suicide attempts in a year. And then a conservative estimate is that at any given time, 5 to 6% of the population is thinking about suicide. So that, in a country of 325 million, ends up being 16 million people right now in America who are thinking about suicide. This is an absolute epidemic. So, what makes it so difficult, then, to talk about this? Why are we finding it so hard to talk about this thing? We don't have a problem talking about 9/11. We don't really have a problem talking about homicide. Why do we find it so hard to talk about this? I'll tell you a story. There was a woman who lived in a house, one of those old farmhouses that has a door in the basement to the outside of the house. And so she went downstairs to do the laundry one day, and somehow somehow the door to the outside had gotten left open through the night, and she goes downstairs to do the laundry, and she finds that there's a skunk in her basement. So she calls the animal control, and she says, "What do I do about this skunk that I have found in my basement?" And he says, "Well, that's super easy. Just leave the door open and put breadcrumbs out to the woods, and that should solve your skunk problem." And so the woman does what the guy says, and she calls back an hour later, and he said, "How did it go?" And she says, "Now I have 2 skunks in my basement." The reason, or when we talk about suicide, we're talking about a 2-skunk problem. When you talk about something like heart disease or diabetes, you have a 1-skunk problem. You've got a medical condition. It's problematic. It's painful. It's consequential, right? So that's a skunk. Calling diabetes a skunk is a good idea. You've got a skunk. But when you're dealing with something like mental illness and suicide, you've got a 2-skunk problem. Because in addition to all that it means to have the condition going on, you also have the shame and stigma of that situation. So it's difficult to talk about this because it's a 2-skunk problem. We fear what we don't know, and we try to explain away that which we can't control. But we are here today because the speakers, at least I can speak for us because I've had conversations with all of us, your sponsors and the people that throw their blood, sweat, and tears into this event, the event organizers, we all believe that there's something that can be done about this phenomenon, or we wouldn't be here. So I'm going to tell you that the moment you say yes, that you are willing to engage in this conversation, is the moment that you solve the most difficult problem that people who are dealing with suicide have. People who are dealing with thoughts of suicide, their biggest problem is not that they need privacy. Their biggest problem is not that they need somebody to fix their problems. Their biggest problem is finding somebody to talk to. Their biggest problem is finding somebody who is willing to talk to them. David Litz, he was the head of the Surgeon General's Task Force on Suicide Prevention in the 90s, said, "People die by suicide for all kinds of reasons, but it basically comes down to 2: loss of hope and loss of social connection." People die by suicide for all kinds of reasons, but it basically comes down to 2: loss of hope and loss of social connection. He said, and if communities of faith can't do something about that, then they should probably close their doors. It's a great quote. So the problem is not that they need privacy. The problem is that they need social connection. It's finding someone to talk to. So here's what I'm going to have you do. The number 1 indicator of future behavior is past behavior. Melissa said, it's great that we can all be in this room using the word suicide in this tone of voice. And I'm going to say, Eric has used the word suicide, Melissa used the word suicide, and I have used the word suicide. But now every one of you are going to use the word suicide. Because if you can use the word suicide in a sentence, you can save a life. So I would like you to turn to the person next to you and use the word suicide in a sentence. Any sentence about anything. Just practice using the word suicide. I'm going to give you 90 seconds to do that. If you haven't switched, switch to the next person so everybody gets a turn. Okay. Congratulations. You are one step closer to saving someone's life. I'm going to repeat that back to you. I'm going to say it again. If you can use the word suicide in a sentence, you can save a life. Because the biggest problem that people who are thinking about suicide have is finding someone to talk to. Yeah, I'll leave that there. But before we can have that conversation, we need to know how to identify these people that we need to have this conversation with. So this is George Bailey. A Wonderful Life, is that? This was before my time. Is that what it is, A Wonderful Life? Yes, okay. All right, so this is George Bailey from It's a Wonderful Life. Sometimes it is the case that this is what desperate people look like. In fact, it would be wonderful if this is what desperate people looked like, because then we would be able to pick them out of a crowd. We would be able to identify them very quickly, and then we would know how to use the word suicide in a sentence, and so that would be great for us. George Bailey here looks disheveled, he looks a bit shell-shocked, he looks wet, he looks confused. Sometimes this is what desperate people look like. Sometimes desperate people look like this. These pictures, Marilyn Monroe, Robin Williams, and Heath Ledger, were the last photographs taken of these people prior to their death. So each of these were taken just a couple days before their deaths. Sometimes this is what desperate people look like. And usually they look like this. So it's really hard for us to know, it's really hard for us to know, how do we know when to use the word suicide in a sentence? How do we know who it is that's floating around the world, waiting for somebody, looking for somebody, desperate for somebody who's willing to talk about it? Well, let's look at the faces of desperation. Many people don't know that Walt Disney himself was someone who thought about suicide. So when we think about the faces of desperation, suicide is currently the third leading cause of death for teenagers. It's the second leading cause of death for people in their 20s. It's estimated that 5 to 6% of adults are thinking about suicide at any given time, and that 17% of youth say that they have seriously considered suicide. That's a lot of people. We know that the highest suicide rates for women are at about age 50. That's when we see suicide rates peak for women. Any idea why that is? Okay, I'm used to speaking to smaller crowds. The reason is because of empty nesting. I'm sure many of you have said that. Issues of identity. If you listen to Eric talk long enough, he'll talk to you about issues of identity and how professional athletes find themselves without their kind of identity that they've formed their lives around. So women, ages 50, it peaks. For men, suicide rates begin to climb at age 65. What happens for men at age 65? Retirement, right? Not anymore, I think it's 67, but anyway. So for men, that's when suicide rates peak. Men over the age of 85 are the most likely to take their lives of any group of people. Men over the age of 85. They're 4 times more likely to take their life than the general population. So for me, the question is not, are there people in this room who are thinking about suicide? I think sometimes we can deceive ourselves into believing that if we showed up here, it's because we care about this issue and we want to be helpers, and that means that we're all healthy and all the problems are out there. Baloney. it is not, I wonder if there are people in this room who are thinking about suicide. The question is, who are the 33 people in this room who are currently thinking about suicide? Because statistically, there are 33 people in this room who are thinking about suicide. In addition to those who are thinking about suicide, 20% of any group of people is anxious for someone close to them who is thinking about suicide. So about a fifth of us are currently worried about someone who's thinking about suicide. So assuming, I don't know if we have a head count, but I'm kind of assuming numbers of 500. If we assume that, then 100 of us are worried about someone who's thinking about suicide. About 33% of people say that they have had some significant impact because of someone who has died by suicide. And then there are many, many people who have been suicidal in the past. So when you think about all of those groups of people, we estimate that about 1 in every 2 persons has been dramatically impacted in one way or another, currently or in the past, by suicide. The irony is that every one of those people is walking around feeling like they're the only one. Isn't that striking? That 50% of this room has been impacted in a deep and core way and walk around the world thinking that I'm the only one. My vision, and what has become my life's work, from Hawaii to upstate New York, is to find a way to create soul-safe communities where the 20% of people who have been suicidal in the past and have found a way to live start sharing their stories with the 6% of people who are currently thinking about taking their own lives. What that would do, if that could happen, the 6% of people would be offered hope and social connection, while the 20% of people who feel shame that they had been there in the first place would find pride in their story instead of stigma and shame. If that teeny tiny thing could happen, we could end the epidemic that has become suicide. But off my soapbox and back to desperation. So when we think about how do you identify the desperate people, the number one thing that people need who are thinking about suicide is someone to talk to. But how do I find them? How do I know who they are? Who are the 33 people in this room? I could ask you to raise your hand, but don't. How do we find them? So there are these 4 categories of things that we think about when we think about signals that someone might need us to engage them in a conversation. What we tend to do, what we tend to think about are behaviors and stress reactions. So very often in this work, I'll hear people link depression with suicide. Oh, I didn't know that person was depressed. And those are depression. Those are warning signs. I mean, those are signs that you should have the conversation. Uncontrollable crying, uncontrollable rage, depressed mood, withdrawal, giving things away. We kind of all know those classic warning signs. But here are a couple statistics that are kind of challenging. 40% of people who die by suicide were not clinically depressed. 40%. We do know that 90% of people who die by suicide had some kind of diagnosable mental health condition, but 40% of those are not suicide, are not depression, and those don't read in the same way. If we've got our antennas up for the depressed, we're going to miss some really pivotal groups. Another interesting statistic, and by interesting I mean horrific, is that men going through a divorce are 10 times more likely to die by suicide than women going through a divorce. Women going through a divorce, I'm making this up, but I bet women going through a divorce are 10 times more likely to be emotional in public. That's a stereotype, I know. But I think it's a helpful one, right? Because women are emotionally expressive in a way that men aren't. So if we've got our antennas up and that's what we're looking for, we're gonna miss some key people. So life situations, like divorce, like legal problems, like incarceration, like the death of a close family member, are their own risk factors. I've got 2 examples of this, and I won't bother telling them to you, but I was at my dad's birthday party and I was at a family reunion. And I had a conversation with 2 different people, 2 different days, 2 different people. One of the guys had had an affair, and one of the guys had lost a son. And they were standing there drinking their coffee. That's all I knew about them. That's all I knew about either one of them. They didn't show any behaviors, no stress reactions, nothing else, but I knew that those were their life situations. I asked both of them, did it ever get so bad that you thought about suicide? And both of them answered, I still think about suicide every day. That's all it took was a life situation for me to say, I wonder, and I'm glad that I did. So we have a sacred call. I'm going to assume that a majority of the people in this room come from an orientation of faith. This comes from the book of Isaiah in the Bible. The Spirit of the Sovereign Lord is on me, because the Lord has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He has sent me to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim freedom for the captives, and to release from darkness, and release from darkness for the prisoners. If people who are thinking about suicide are not brokenhearted, I don't know who is. If people who have lost someone to suicide or have had thoughts of suicide in the past aren't captive to their shame, I don't know who is. And if people who are worried about someone thinking about suicide aren't imprisoned by fear, then I don't know who is. This call that we have on our lives is to do this good work. And so I'm going to work you through that. Put together a model that is the call. And I don't even care if you aren't a person of faith. We are called as what it is to be part of the human family to do this work. So it's very, very simple. The C in call says that if I am ever having thoughts of suicide, I am going to commit to tell. I just said to you that I don't presume that because you're in this room, you haven't thought about suicide. And I certainly don't presume that if you're in this room, you will never be at risk for thinking about suicide. Because if you're not today, and one of those life situations happens to you, you could find yourself right there. So the very first step in creating a soul-safe community is that we all commit that if I'm ever thinking about suicide, I'm going to tell someone. Now, I happen to know that you have little pencils on your table, and I don't care where you write it, but I want you to take 30 seconds and write down the names of 2 people that you will tell if you're ever thinking about suicide. I'll give you 30 seconds. Okay, that was a little more than 30 seconds, but it's an important exercise because the best predictor of future behavior is past behavior. And if you have already identified those people, then you're a little bit safer because you have. So number 1, letter C, commit that you'll tell if you're ever thinking about suicide. Letter A, ask the question. Yeah, I don't know. So we need to ask the question to people who we think might be thinking about suicide for all the reasons that we said before. We need to ask it in a way that is clear and compassionate. Now, I know we're in Texas, and Texas is the polite South. I don't know how many times I've been called sugar since I've been in this state. You don't always say things super directly here, but the research shows the best way to do a suicide intervention is to ask the question directly by using the word suicide in a sentence. And I'm going to give you two ways to ask this question. Number one, sometimes when people are going through what you're going through, they think about suicide. Are you thinking about suicide? Sometimes when people are going through what you're going through, they start to think about suicide. Are you thinking about suicide? The other way to ask the question is to say, another way to ask the question is to say, does it ever get so bad that sometimes you think about suicide? Does it ever get so bad that sometimes you think about suicide? I would like you to turn to the person next to you, and I'm going to give you 90 seconds, and I would like you to practice asking that question. One way or another, whichever one feels right. I'll give you 90 seconds, and then we'll come back. If you haven't switched places, switch so everybody gets a turn. I tell you to switch and you stop talking. Okay. As I said, the best predictor of future behavior is past behavior. And if you can ask those questions in this room, then you can ask them when you leave this room. Now, I have a friend who went to a physical trainer, and he said to the physical trainer, so what is the best exercise to do? And the physical trainer said, whichever one you'll actually do. Right? So I don't care if you use these questions. I want you to use the questions that you'll actually use. But these are two ways that we have found that are clear and compassionate. They normalize that the person isn't crazy, that this is not abnormal behavior. Sometimes when people are going through what you're going through, they start to think about suicide. So ask the question. The next letter in the call model, first we commit to tell if we're ever thinking about suicide. Then we ask the question. And then we listen. The book of James says, be quick to listen and slow to speak. Unfortunately, what happens when we get anxious, which if suicide doesn't make us anxious, I don't know what does. When somebody says, yes, I'm thinking about suicide, our tendency is to talk a ton, to talk really fast, to try to fix. We're not very good at shutting up and listening. But that's what the people need. The number one problem that people have is finding someone to talk to. It's finding someone that they can talk to. They don't need to listen to you talk. They need to talk for themselves. So inviting them to tell you the story. How did suicide become part of your thinking? How did it become a solution to your problems? And very often listening in itself is useful because people get out of their own heads and they're able to hear themselves. Finally, we lead to safety. If somebody, the only task we have after we've listened to the story is to leave this person in good hands. Think about CPR. Think about when you learn CPR, your job is to keep someone alive long enough to get them into the ambulance. Your job is not to do heart surgery on the spot. Lord help us all. Don't do that. Your job is to keep them alive long enough to get them into good hands. So if somebody has just gone through a breakup, this is not the time to be signing them up for Match.com. Right? This is the time. This is not the time to be fixing. This is the time to hear their stories long enough and then share the resources. Up here I have put the National Suicide Prevention Hotline, the number for the Samaritan Counseling Center here in Tyler, 911, but also I walked in the room, I didn't know you were gonna have these things on your table. And so this right here has all the resources, not all the resources, has resources in your community, this thing that says breathe. So leave them in good hands. Know who's in your community and have that ready to share. Know where that thing is, hang it on your refrigerator. Don't have to wonder when you're at a family reunion and you ask the question and then realize, I don't know who the resources are. Keep that close. If you're here and you're thinking about suicide, I want you to know that there's hope. 500 people came together today to show you that they want to hear your story. I'll be at the book table out there with my reinvention book, and if you're thinking about suicide, hunt me down. I want to listen. If you're here today and you're worried about someone who is thinking about suicide, be in touch with the people on this card. Contact Samaritan Counseling Center of Tyler, Texas, and ask them for help. If you're here today and you've lost someone to suicide, nobody can ever make that better for you. But I can say that you don't need to suffer alone. There are people in this room who want to hear it. And if you're here today and you have considered suicide in the past and have found a way to live with hope and social connection, we need your stories. I would ask you to do what Eric has done and to do what Melissa has done and begin to share your story, because there are people out there who need it. Thank you for having me. Now let's go out into the world and create communities where no one loses hope and no one is alone.